Hi, everybody. It's CC and JT from the CC and JT Amateur, where Productions Value Go to Die, and we're doing our bi-weekly writer interview, where we bring writers in from around the world to talk about the craft of writing. Every adventure that we've done with these writers has been fantastic and really, really interesting to us because not only do we learn more about what it's like to be a writer, we also find that no matter how far apart we are, we're actually closer than we think. And so we have Arnie Bernstein. We're so happy to have him on board today. And like I said, not only we're so different, but we're so close because Arnie brings some WGN experience with us. And at the beginning of our marriage, it was WGN that helped bring Cece and I together, which we'll
Oh, no
talk about
kidding.
down the road. So that might be a cute little story, maybe only for the three people here on the podcast. But we'll talk about that.
You
Arnie,
on Bozo Circus together, right?
Yes.
so let's talk a little bit about you. Introduce yourselves to our audience.
Okay. Arnie Bernstein, as you know. I live in Chicago, where it's snowing today. And Chicago born and bred. Lived in the north side for many, many years. Actually lived about 2 blocks from Wrigley Field. And I'm a diehard White Sox fan. So I kept all my White Sox stuff in the corner of the apartment closest to Wrigley. And they didn't need my help in those years, but gave it a little mojo anyway. And let's see, what else do people want to know about me? I've published 5 books. I'm working on 2 more. I'm having some of my books republished this year. And I love to write on typewriters. I do all my first draft on manual typewriters. And I have a pretty impressive stable. I'm repairing 2 right now, which is a new experience for me. I'm not very handy with things, but I'm learning. Anything I'm missing here?
No, actually, I'm fascinated by your typewriters because I noticed you had some pictures of them on your website. And I see that you have several Royals, which I believe one of the local Nevada authors wrote a book. Let's see, what was his name? Robert Laxalt?
Yes, Robert
Wrote a book
Laxalt.
it was called Travels with My Royal.
Oh,
And
wow.
so there is probably maybe a segment of our viewership that would not be familiar with manual typewriters. So could you explain a little bit about that process, how it works for you?
It's funny you bring up Royal because that's the ones I learned on. And other kids couldn't wait for driver's ed. I couldn't wait for typing back in the day. I picked up pretty quick. I learned to touch type, which is invaluable skill for a writer. And it's funny because one day after the class, the teacher came in, and God bless Miss Begley, but she looked a little like Frau Blucher from Young Frankenstein. And I was in the typing room and, pounding away, and she came in and she looked a little surprised. She said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I'm writing." She said, "I thought you took it as a blow-off class." I said, "No, I type almost every day." And she looked a little stunned and then, disappeared into her office. But, I was pleased. Like everybody else, I went from typewriters to computers, which terrified me. And then once I got used to it, I got used to it. But there was something I missed. I missed the tactile feel, the slamming, the kick, the noises, all that stuff. And we went to the American Writers Museum here in Chicago, which everybody should go to if you ever have the opportunity. Nice little museum. And they have a bay of typewriters. So I got on it and it was a Royal too, actually, and started pounding away. And I thought, gosh, I need to get back to this. And started, my hunts, Facebook Marketplace, local antique shops, eBay, which I would not recommend, but I robbed a guy on eBay with what I got. And there's one antique shop I go to in my neighborhood that I've picked up some good typewriters at. It's an interesting hunt to get these. Ribbons, all those things are easy to find. eBay, something like that. And there's typewriter repair shops. We have a really great one in Chicago that I got my typewriter refurbished. One of my typewriters. Like I say, I love the tactile feel. And it's the nice thing about the typewriter, it doesn't have any distractions. You can't get onto Facebook or play solitaire or anything like that. And I keep my electronics away from me when I'm on the typewriter. They're locked away. And if I need to research something, I'll type in research something here in capitalize. And the neat thing about typewriters is you just have to keep plowing forward. You can't go back unless you want to X something out that, is wrong, which I rarely do. You just keep going forward. Can't think of a word, I'll type. And I do this with a computer too, but if I can't think of the right word at the moment, I'll just type in word in all caps or in parentheses or something in all caps. If I get stuck, or I think a line, I like the concept, but I don't like the way it's turning out, I'll write fix this, all caps, or amp up, or gin up, in all caps, just so when I go back, I know that's what I got to do. I love the feel of the putting the paper in. I like changing ribbons. I'm such a geek. It's it feels like real writing, and it takes me back to those days when I first, I could, like I said, I couldn't wait to take typing. And it's real easy to transfer them to computer files. I scan the sheets, load them up to Google Docs, and it comes up as a PDF. You open it in Google Docs, and a lot of it looks like gobbledygook from things that the Google Docs doesn't recognize. I select all, reformat, check spelling, remove the extra paragraph marks, things like that. I download it to Microsoft Word because I like to use Microsoft Word for that. So, and then I do my editing process, and if I have to go back, make my changes, I'll do it in Word. But the initial drafts are all done on typewriters. I call it my version of Hemingway's dictum: write drunk, edit sober. So,
yes,
get your typewriter. It will change your writing process. I was shocked how much more creative I've become once I went back to those things.
My first tool of choice was an old Underwood.
That's fantastic.
The two-story Underwood that was about this
Yeah.
big. Boom,
Yeah.
boom, boom. That kind
Right.
of thing. You really had to put your back into it to write, and that brings back some memories.
I love those old things.
I'm going to go a little bit to the other.
I take my typewriter to the coffee shop, sometimes. And
really?
I'm known as the typewriter guy. And people, I've actually had people, bring their typewriters to me there and, ask what I can do with, help them out and et cetera. But what's really fun is seeing when the little kids see me type. And I'll say, hey, you want to try it? And they do. And it's a wonder to them that you can actually do that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, like I was saying, we're going to go to the other scale with your writing experience, because this is a podcast to help writers write. The issue of objectivity, I think, is an important thing to address. And you've written a couple of books that, forgive me for saying this, even though they were a few years ago, they could probably serve as triggers today. Swastika Nation and the Bath Massacre. Both very emotional historical books that needed to be written. They need to be there. But where did you find, I don't want to say the word courage, where did you find the fortitude to do these very emotional books and get them out there? How much of it did you have to disassociate yourself, or did you have to put yourself in the books?
I'll go with Bath Massacre, America's first school bombing. I'll do that one first, since that came earlier. I've been, hunting around for a story that I wanted to write. And I'm mostly a nonfiction guy. And I was looking for a great narrative nonfiction. People may be familiar with the website Find a Grave, which I get lost on all the time. And I saw something called Bath School Disaster. I said, what is this? It was, Lansing, Michigan. Actually, a little town called Bath, which is outside of Lansing, Michigan. About 3.5 hour drive, depending on how much coffee I've had. And I saw this thing about what had happened. Short version is that a school trustee had laced the local school, which is kindergarten through high school. He had laced it with 600 pounds of dynamite. 100 pounds went off. Not sure why the other 500 did not go off. It was, maybe, the wires got ripped loose or the timers were off or something. And at the same time, his house caught on fire. He took off in his truck, pulled up in front of the school. The superintendent, who he had always fought with on the school board, came up, and even though the animosity, he said, "I need your help." It was a horrifying scene. He said, "We need your help. We have to get trucks and ladders." And this was told me by an eyewitness. And he said, Keogh said, "Okay, I'll take you with me." And the superintendent, Emery Hike, said, "You know something about this, don't you?" And Keogh blew up his truck and took them, blew them literally to bits, the two of them. And, a few other people were killed as a result. And they found the body of his wife the next day, burned beyond recognition, but they knew it was her because she was missing. And like in a cart that was on top of a couple of wheels of some sort. And there was like a place next door were two silver boxes. One had like war bonds, things like that. The other had family silverware, ephemera like that. It was just such a good story. And I went to Bath, and they have a museum there it's a dedicated space in the school. They tore down what remained of the old school in the 70s because they rebuilt what they had after the bombing, and it wasn't too hard. And that school was in use for years and years, and they tore it down in the 70s. It was quite controversial, too, when they tore it down. And today it's a park. It's a lovely park, too, with the cupola that was on top of the school centers the park. It's centered in the park roughly where it would have been when the school stood, and names of the victims and things like that. And inside the museum, there's things that were there that day, the clock that is stopped at the time it went off, the flag that was hanging up, pictures, photographs, things like that. And so I went there to meet the school committee. I called them. I found some guy who called himself the historian of the town, and I went and visited him, and he showed me around, and then he had me call the people who ran the museum. I figured I better make this good. This is small town America. If you think of the quintessential small Midwestern town, it's Bath. They don't even have a stoplight in town. And a lot of it looks like it did back in the 20s, too. So I brought a lot of books that were my models, things like that, and info about me. And I was going to meet with them the next day. I had dinner with a friend of mine the night before, and she said, "I never saw you so scared in your life." Went in, did my presentation, and it took about a year. I kept coming back, and for them to trust me and really get to know who I am. They didn't want me to interview survivors at first. I'm going to write this thing without writing, talk to survivors. But, I said, okay, I won't. And eventually, after they warmed up to me, the floodgates opened. I found out later, too. I said, I just want to, what did you think of me when I first came here? He said, after you left, we said we knew we had our guy. I said, what? Yeah, apparently people had come to them many times, wanted to do a book, and you could only go through the museum board to really get anything done. People had come, and they didn't like what they were doing. And I guess Michael Moore was doing Bowling for Columbine at the time. And Flint is not far from Lansing. From Lansing and from Bath. And I guess he was a real asshole, being Michael Moore and everything. And they refused to cooperate with him. And that was a few months before I came. And a friend of mine said, you could have only looked like, the nicest guy in the world compared to Michael Moore. So, it was probably, Providence that happened for you. And he was probably right. The hardest thing in that book was getting inside the head of the killer. He left only one thing. On the edge of his farm, he had a stenciled sign that said, "Killers are made, not born." And why did he do it? I wrote a confession in his hand. It made absolutely no sense. And it didn't, it helped in that his mind was impenetrable. And ultimately, I did some research on psychopathy. And most people, think psychopath, it's guy running around with an axe and hunting teenagers in a movie. But it's a serious condition. And the ultimate result of why is there is no why. And I had to bolster that. Why there is no why. Because it was the 20s, I used Clarence Darrow's sum up for the Leopold and Loeb trial to save their lives from the death penalty. Parts of that were useful. Parts of a book I found written by the man who created basically the gold standard of how to, delineate who is a psychopath, which could be anybody from an office bully to a guy who blows up a school. And, I wrote in the book, ultimately, the human mind wants to find a why. In this case, there is no why. The why was blown to pieces with him. That's a long version, I know. But I never...
No, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, it never
So I guess you were
me.
basically attacking this issue from a journalistic point of view, trying to
Correct.
Try to do the analysis. But as I asked before, how did it appeal to you as a person? I mean, was this a goal, or was this a heartfelt tragedy? How did you feel? Because writers, we have challenges sometimes with either
Right.
association or disassociation to the extremes. So for Arnie the person, how did this very tragic event affect you?
It's interesting. When I went there, I was going to write the book. I was going to write my book. This is going to be my version of In Cold Blood, which was a model for me, by the way, when I was writing, as was Norman Mailer's The Executioner's Song.
Mm-hmm.
Both were great models.
Everybody.
But yeah, we can talk about that later. But I met with these people, and then I went to the graveyard where 17 of the victims are buried, and it was like a smack in the head with a 2x4. I said, "This is not my book. This is their book, and I have a duty to these children." And by God, I'll, give them, what, they deserve. That's when it changed for me. A couple hours after I met with this committee, you see tiny graves after graves, born 1914, died 1927, 1990, 2027, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, they were mostly first and second graders, which, it just breaks your heart. Well, and it's still the deadliest killing in American history, deadliest school killing in American history. Children and 6 adults, counting the killer and his wife. 2 teachers died, the superintendent died, and a postman was killed when the truck blew up.
So obviously,
emotionally, how did it affect me? I don't think it affected me, but I only remember one dream I had where I was trapped in a place I couldn't get out of. My wife said she noticed it bothered me. I didn't notice, maybe because I was so close to the topic. And today the people, this thing was first published in 2009, and then we had a second edition come out a few years ago. People in Bath are my best friends. I go up there every year. And I'm sort of like an honorary Bathian. They all love me. I love all of them. I became really close with one of the survivors, whose brother had been killed that day. She told me some of the goriest stuff, and I felt bad. She was in her, late 80s, early 90s. And, you don't have to tell me this. I didn't want to upset her. She goes, no, very firm voice. I want people to know what happened. And that was another, okay. This is, and I think their initial impression, they said it was graphic but good, was the feedback I got from the people in Bath. And actually, Josephine and I became very close, good pals. And, it's, I have a lot of wonderful pictures of us. It was really great at the book launch party. It was at the Lansing Library. And C-SPAN filmed it and everything. It was great. And when I was doing my signing, I looked up and there was Josephine. There was a long line. People were having her sign the book. I was just thrilled to pieces. And I had her sign mine, and she was writing Josephine Cushman Vale, Survivor. And she became one of my best friends in the world. I still miss her. She died about 10 years ago. I miss her terribly. I have a picture of her and me above my desk here. And I have a picture of her also in my office of her signing those books. That's a long version of a short, of how it affected me. Go ahead, ask me something else.
Well, as somebody who's fascinated by history, I know that growing up, history, we are taught dates and places, and we're taught generically about people. We kind of know their name and who they were, but we don't really get the inside story. So it sounds like you went into a lot of detail about the people involved on both sides of this disaster. And how important, or did you realize the importance of presenting that to the public so that they learn the true story and not just the dates and the very surface
everybody, that's
detail.
The most boring kind of history too, that, is why kids don't like history in high school. But history has always been, and biography's always been my favorite. I got my graduate degree at a small school here in Chicago, Columbia College. And at the time, the program I was in was run by a man named John Schultz, who was visionary when it came to writing. He actually wrote the definitive books on the 1968 Chicago riots and the Chicago 7 trial. And John's whole thing was getting your voice on the page. Don't worry about the grammar. Don't worry about the spelling. You can clean that up later. I'm not into writing theory. Just get the words on the page and clean it up later. But it really helped make things vivid. Obviously, there's a lot more to the method than that, but it made things vivid for me. It's character driven for my stuff. You get to know who the people are. I do this through interviews, through, going through old documents, things like that, other books that have been written, all sorts of things like that. Now, Swastika Nation, Fritz Kuhn and the Rise and Fall of the German-American Bund, which is coming out in a new updated edition later this year. We can talk about that later. But like all good things, it started at the movies. I went to see Inglourious Bastards, the movie with the happiest ending ever, and I won't tell people what it is if you haven't seen it, but you apparently quite agree with me. It's the movie with the happiest ending ever. And you didn't want to be sitting next to me in the theater because I was whooping it up at that point. For those not familiar, among other things, it's about a group of American Jewish soldiers who are parachuted into Nazi-occupied France and go terrorizing around the country, killing Nazis. And after I saw that, I got interested in what were the real stories of people who went after killing Nazis and, fighting back. And there was some really great stuff out there. But I kept coming across these German-American Bund stories. It was a short version. It was a pro-Nazi organization that presented themselves as an American organization. And their leader, Fritz Kuhn, who was quite a character, part Popinjay, part mad genius, part Nazi to the core. And I just kept stumbling into these stories in different books. I thought, well, this hasn't been all collated into a book. And so that's how, the very short version of how this book got the genesis of it and how it was created. I'll never have a cast of characters like this again. It's so crazy. You got Kuhn, who, as I say, was part Popinjay, part genius, part madman. The Henry Ford's in it. God, who else? Walter Winchell, who is the unsung hero of this thing, I think. Fiorello LaGuardia and Thomas Dewey, who was then the prosecutor in New York. You had the genesis of HUAC. It was called something else at the time. You had Hollywood personalities, Edward G. Robinson, Walt Disney, and the mobsters who got involved. Meyer Lansky, the Jewish mobsters went after these guys. Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Mickey Cohen, Longy Swillman. It was this wild, wild, wild cast of characters and these wonderful set pieces. It was, I'll never have, like I said, I'll never have a cast that good again. It just drove itself. The writing just drove itself because, I was describing all these things. I was imagining myself into it, and that helped bring it alive. And certainly consulting other books, consulting transcripts, news stories. Certainly the news stories had a bias, so that helped. And obviously I was not going for a pro-Nazi. The book's name, and I kind of pictured people opening and go, hey, this guy doesn't like Nazis. And actually there was if you go look at the Amazon, there's one guy who clearly had a feeling about my
So let's touch on this just a little bit more before we dive into Act 2 and the questions that we sent you. You being the resident expert on the American Bund, which happened almost 100 years ago. History repeats itself, but only the bad parts. And you being a resident expert of the American Bund, which almost happened, that particular chapter of American history happened almost 100 years ago. Watching today's news must be kind of I don't want to say trigger, but must be sort of this happened before, this happened before, this happened before. Is that what you're seeing? And how do you react to that?
That's the question I get the most, it seems. This book was written before Trump, to go with the obvious. Now, there certainly were neo-Nazi, figures throughout. I actually went to high school in Skokie, Illinois, during the years of the infamous Nazi rally that they wanted to have. An interesting, well, I'll get into that later. But, and I was there the day they were supposed to come in, and believe me, people couldn't wait for them to come in, and they wisely turned tail and ran. So, it's always interested me, neo-Nazism. Now, I wrote this, as I say, before Trump was elected, and in 2016, I did an article for Tablet, and people were saying, oh, he's Hitler, and I wrote a piece, they called it, what did we call it? Fritz Kuhn's Celebrity Apprentice. Fritz Kuhn, again, being the Bundeswehr, the leader of this group. And I wrote basically, he's a Popinjay. Trump's a Popinjay like Kuhn was. Boy, was that naive, huh? But when, people, does it compare? No, I don't think so. I'm really hesitant to go into the Godin syndrome, where the longer an internet, the discussion goes on, the sooner things, somebody's calling each other Hitler or something like that. I'm really hesitant to do that, because what Hitler did, and the Nazi government it's beyond wrapping our heads around. That's not what Trump is doing. He's not, shoving people into ovens. If somebody says yet, well, there's a difference between America and Nazi Germany. America, we still have the First Amendment. In Germany, they didn't have the First Amendment. But what I find interesting, I don't just limit it. If you want to compare it to Trump, I would compare it to other groups as well. The so-called Jewish Voice for Peace, which is none of the above. And you see the rallies in front of synagogues the other night in New York. I've seen stuff here. Those so-called pro-Palestine movements, they say they aren't anti-Semitic, but for some reason, they always go to synagogues when they want to protest, whatever they're protesting, and, tearing down the posters of hostages and, horrible things. It goes both ways. That horseshoe theory where, the extremes eventually meet in the middle. That's how some of the tactics were the same. Intimidation, certainly. They didn't have the internet. they hung out a shingle. I actually have a picture of me in front of their headquarters in New York, me, giving the finger to the camera. And they wore the Nazi uniforms. And, they were clearly Nazis. And ultimately, that was their downfall. Yeah, there were, the guy in the hoodie that said Camp Auschwitz, at the insurrection. And Kuhn and the Bund dreamed of the day, they called it Der Tag, when apparently the Jews who controlled America the Bund and, allies would take over and, and the swastika would fly over the White House, et cetera, et cetera. Well, certainly January 6th was, a version of Der Tag. But the difference is, it was quelled and, you could say Trump was reelected, but he's not a Nazi again. I think he's more like Joe Colombo, to be honest. He operates like a mob boss. Not a very good one, but he operates like a mob boss. Yeah, they're a parallel, but I don't see them as the same. They were a unique group in a unique time in American history and world history.
Okay. Nope, that's a fair answer. No, that's a fair answer. It's just, I have reasonable concerns about the country. You and I, the three of us, we're all in basically the same age demographic. And so we've seen some wonderful times and we've seen some horrible times. And it's our I don't want to say responsibility, our duty or anything like that, but we as writers, we have to be honest to the times too, or we become part of the problem. And so I was really fascinated by your perspective on this subject because you do have the long view from back to 1930s and before that. So
I wasn't sure if I was writing comedy or farce, or not comedy, or drama or farce, because some of it was like deadly serious, and others were just so incredibly funny because these guys were really incompetent.
Yes.
Here's the fun part. My birthday is April 20th, the same as a guy named Adolf Hitler. And actually, when the Nazis came to Skokie, they wanted to march on my birthday, and boy, did we have a lot of fun with that. That was not the day, obviously. But every time they were celebrating Hitler's birthday, the Bund and others, when I was writing it, I would giggle like a little kid. And I think, yeah, guess who's coming along in a few years to tell your story? It was just fun for me. It was cathartic. It was great.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and segue into Act 2. Act 2,
Okay.
and the purpose of these questions that we borrowed from James Lipton's Inside the Actor's Studio, the purpose of these questions, again, is to help writers write. What we hope is that you answer these questions and perhaps other writers watching this will feel, hey, that's me. So Let's just go down this list, and I'm going to ask the first question. What was your first I am an honest-to-goodness writer moment?
Boy, oh boy, oh boy. I guess I always knew, from when I was a zygote, that writing was my thing. One of my happiest memories when I was 4 years old, my mom took me to the public library and I walked out with a big stack of books, and it felt like I had the power of the world in my hands. My mother, was I have ultimately become my mother's son. She was, no TV and read more, and I barely watch television these days, and I read more. But I think when I was in high school, when I was starting to read and thinking, this is kind of interesting, I'd like to do this. My favorite, class was creative writing. Mrs. Shapiro, God bless her, encouraged me to, she saw something in me. I was not, let's say this, I was graduated in the top 90% of my class in high school. I exaggerate a touch here and there, but she really encouraged me because she saw this spark that I had, and it just started writing. And I had a couple things, horrible things in retrospect, published in the school magazine. Somebody once said to me, "Bernstein, you are so sick." I said, "Yeah." I was doing my Philip Roth impersonations. I was a huge fan of Roth, and I read Portnoy's Complaint when I was like 14, and it was, whoa, you can say all this in a book. So I started writing like that, and I had some fun. You're 16 years old, and it's you're adolescent, and it's all fun and new, and you want to shock. I can't believe they published I'm sure it was garbage. Today, I don't even have copies of it, but I said, I can do this. And I was already writing then. I had screenplays, stories, things like that. I guess I knew pretty early on. It wasn't that eureka moment. Like I say, from a zygote, I kind of knew, and that's I've developed over the years. I keep saying every book is my first book because I'm learning how to do it all over again and learning how to do it better.
That's a great point. It sounds like you've had a lot of inspiration over the years, but do you have a particular writing role model? who would that be and why?
Wow, that is such a complex question. I mean, Philip Roth certainly sparked me. And I know that's not the most popular choice to say. I also got into Norman Mailer a lot, which is, again, not a popular choice. But, just really good writing that just grabbed me and that I could want to, adapt as my own. You may have noticed that when I'm drinking coffee, it's my Goodfellas cup. Movies certainly have... influenced me. Really good, dialogue-driven movies. The Marx Brothers, who I absolutely love. Lenny Bruce, who I absolutely love. The way they use words. It also is a major influence. And I write serious stuff, and yet it's the comedians who seem to have the most influence on me. And certainly John Schultz.
And I think you may have answered this question, but let's see if we can hit this. What do you absolutely love about writing?
The whole process. The creativity. When you get in that zone and you're hitting your marks, it's exhilarating. And when I emerge from a writing session, my mother-in-law asked me, "Were you sleeping?" I said, "You should try to sleep like this sometime." But you just immerse yourself into a world that is yours and yours alone. I love writing. I'm one of those few people who loves the writing and not having written. Those initial drafts, there's nothing like it.
No. We just finished manuscripts this week, each of us individually.
Oh, wow.
And we were both in our own worlds, and so we get it. We just get it.
Yeah.
So anyway.
So basically, it sounds like you love just about everything about the writing process, but is there any part that you dread?
Boy, oh boy, coming up with ideas, finding a good story, because I'm a nonfiction writer, so that and certainly rejection, like everybody else. I had a book project I'd been passionate about for years. Never sold. I broke my heart. And then somebody came out with a similar idea, and I couldn't help but wonder, did one of the people who reject me, because this guy was much better known than me, could one of the people have, said, "Hey, here's an idea"? I'll never know, but something really smelled about it. Mm-hmm. And certainly people who rip me off, I won't name names, but there are certainly a person apiece I know of on Massacre and Swastika Nation who've ripped me off. It's annoying.
Yes.
It would be.
Oh my gosh. So, you talked about the influence of your mother and other folks in this, to inspire you and move you along. But is there a single significant life experience that affects your writing, either good or bad? Is there a single significant?
Not that I can think of. It's just, this is what I do. This is who I am. This is, it's. I ran away from it for a long time. I wasn't, early 20s, I just kind of, fooled around and, did the stupid things that, people do in their early 20s. And then I realized this is what I love the best. And, once I got into it, all stops, were pulled. I originally wanted to go to Hollywood, and start writing scripts and things like that. But I thought, you know what? A, the odds are against me. B, I don't watch much television. Why would I want to write for television? And I won a contest, by the way, that was put out by Warner Brothers on TV comedy writing. And it was taught by the guy who created Night Court. It was like a master's class in how to write a TV script. And I was good at it, but the odds were against me, and I don't watch much television. So why would I want to waste my life on stuff like that? I realize I'm a better prose writer, and I like writing prose.
No, that's fascinating. I've done my share of trying to submit things to Hollywood, so I know that can be really heartbreaking.
Yeah.
So,
not that book publishing is easier, but
No.
And I like to say publishing is I like to say publishing is a racket, and I'm from Chicago. We know from rackets. And it's the worst racket there is.
And that's something else we have in common. I mean, Chicago has that kind of, the 1920s, 30s mobster type thing going on. Plus, as Nevadans, we remember Las Vegas back in the early days.
Oh, sure.
Vegas was run by the mob, and it's actually run better than it runs today.
Right. It's funny. Yeah. Capone showed up in Bath Massacre because he had a little place nearby. He liked it there. And, and he shows up in Swastika Nation as well. And I like to say I'm from Chicago. It's the law that we have to work Al Capone into any book. So somehow I've managed to do it. I don't know about the next one, but he managed to work himself into this one.
So it sounds like you've already mentioned that you basically are a writer. That's just who you are.
Exactly.
And we've gotten a variety of responses to this particular question, but would you recommend the writing life to a loved one, and why or why not?
I don't know. I've never had a loved one. I could say, but like when young people or someone else, says, "Hey, I am interested in becoming a writer. What should I do?" I say, "Become a plumber. You'll earn more money. You'll get more respect, and you'll have to work. Yeah, and you'll get to work with a lot less shit." But on the end, of course, the Dorothy Parker, advice: give them a copy of Elements of Style and shoot them while they're still happy. But seriously, I tell people it's a hard life. It's not easy. There's a reason I look as ugly as I do. I'm really 25, and they don't buy that one. But it's a hard life. It's not an easy life. But if you want to do it, if you want to do it, you got to want it more than anything in the world. And it's not something you do on the side. The main job you do to earn money, that's on the side. It's the writing that is what drives you.
So this next question we've had a lot of fun with. I mean, well, for instance, we learned about somebody who we thought we knew, but we found out that they had a very extensive comic book collection. Walls of comic books. So when we ask this question, I want you to sort of think of it in that kind of way. What is something unexpected in your past that we won't see in your bio?
In my salad days when I was broke, I used to street juggle. I haven't talked about that in years. I made good money. I once paid off my electric bill in quarters. All in quarters. Back when you couldn't write a check or get on the internet. I would go to the electric company with a bag full of quarters. It was fun. I don't talk about it much anymore, and I certainly can't juggle like I used to, and I don't want to. But it was fun. It was funny. I was downtown Chicago a couple of years ago, and there were these kids who were juggling for money, and I said, "Dude, I'm looking back at my past when I see you," and we laughed. But yeah, I think that's probably it was fun. I park in front of the Lincoln Park Zoo, and I could make a good chunk of change. It was a fun moment.
That's great. That's just great. Okay, before we throw it to you, for you to tell us where we can find you on the internet, we did promise you a WGN story, which you have in your background.
Yeah.
Our WGN story is we got married many, many years ago. We're going to date ourselves here, and you might find this amusing or not, but we got married many years ago, and I was stationed in Omaha at Offutt Air Force Base, which I'm sure you've heard of from being from the Midwest. And we got a TV finally, and then of course one of those choices in Omaha, Nebraska was WGN, and so one of the things that brought us together was watching WGN, Harry Carey, and Steve Stone.
Yep.
Day games for the Chicago Cubs, and that's where we became Chicago Cubs fans, was via the day games at WGN, funny. Watching Harry Carey.
Yeah.
WGN,
he was with the White Sox first.
Yeah. We understand that you're a White Sox fan, and that now that you've got the Pope on your side, I'm thinking you guys are gonna go in the right direction from here.
He can perform. I don't know if he can perform that kind of miracle, but I sure hope so. He's actually from this neighborhood, and people are really excited when he became Pope. Nobody could believe, a local boy made good and then some. And I'm Jewish, but I was.
That's fantastic. And Chicago is just having such a great string of good news when it comes to sports, because you've got the Pope, you've got that great Chicago Bears game that we were just watching.
God, yeah, that was great.
I scared Cece here from on that last play, things like that, and then of course we got Bergman and things like that. So Chicago's having a good string, and we're going to just say thank you, Your Holiness.
Yeah, it's funny. I have a T-shirt. It says the Sox logo where there's a guy with the bat. There's it's the Pope, and he's got a cross instead of a bat. And they're actually, the Sox are selling jerseys that say Leo 14 on the back. There's a picture of him too, awesome, when he was at the World Series in 2005. He's a Sox fan. I guess somebody he was yelling "Go Cubs" or something when they were in the playoffs this past year, and he said they lost. He's a true Sox fan.
Yeah.
His favorite teams are the White Sox and whoever plays the Cubs. And now everyone has learned a lesson in
Right.
Chicago
Nope, that's
baseball.
fine. A little heated rivalry is always good for the sport.
Yep.
It's good for the fans. It keeps us interested. It keeps us engaged. So before we let you go, could you please remind everybody where we can find you on the internet, where we can find your books?
You can find me at www.arniebernstein.com. My name, all one word. Please, please, please subscribe to my Substack, The Typewriters Collage. Very easy to find. It's a combination of humor, personal essays, things about the writing life. I have a lot of fun with it. Certainly, Facebook. Not so much the other ones, but I'm there. As for buying my books, I'm wearing my shirt from my local indie bookstore. He's in Chicago, which is maybe just a couple blocks from me. Indie bookstores. I can't remember what it is. There's one online source. I can't remember what it is to save my life. Where you can buy from independent bookstores. If you
Is
can
that
find that would be good.
bookshop.org or something like that?
Yeah, I
maybe?
think it's bookshop.org. That's it.
Yep.
That's it. And they connect and money goes to those stores.
Mm-hmm.
I do not recommend the online jungle. They have ripped off writers of royalties. I can promise you that one. And B, they're trying to basically drive everyone out of business, let alone, and they have hurt bookstores. And I've been extremely fortunate in my entire adult life. I've always lived within walking distance of an independent bookstore, which is a rarity, but even today I got it. And support your local indie bookstore. If you don't have my books at your local indie bookstore, ask for them. Ask for them. Ask them to carry them. Yeah, I would infinitely prefer that than the online jungle river, but we're full of piranhas. If that's what you're gonna do, that's what you're gonna do. I do not emphasize it on my website. As a matter of fact, I emphasize the indie sources first and my local bookstore. And if you want a signed copy, so you can get it through my local bookstore.
And I'll make sure to get all those links on this blog post.
Terrific. Thank you.
We'll be putting up here. So we'll make sure we'll get that all out there. So what we want to do now is we want to thank Arnie Bernstein for joining us on this podcast. This has been incredibly fascinating. We could be here for 2 or 3 hours talking about all this stuff, and I really wish we could. So maybe sometime down the road we can invite you back, and because
oh sure,
I think you
love it.
so
I've had
many
a good time
stories
there.
to tell. But what more importantly, not only are these good stories to tell, these are good stories that people need to hear. So anyway, this has been the CC&JT Amateur Hour, where production values go to die. What we do is we invite writers on here to give a perspective where we can help writers not only learn from our colleagues, but learn that, hey, maybe we're not alone when we're pounding in a dark room at a typewriter. We've got more things in common than we don't. So thank you again, Arnie. Please take care.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you.